Good. So I'm very pleased to present this on behalf of Ben Bennett, who is in the audience, and Abdurrahman Wan, who I hope is online. Yeah, better? Okay. Next slide. So this paper doesn't so much arise from a research question as from a research opportunity to capitalize on, explore, and expand on two studies of beef value chains in Southern Africa, Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, and Zimbabwe. And these two countries and their value chains have some striking common features. Firstly, in the multifunctionality and the high cultural value of cattle. Secondly, in a dualistic system of land tenure that includes communal grazing for cattle in one half of that duality, and also a very high sensitivity to EU meat import policy. But the countries are contrasted, firstly, in the way they have responded politically to that heritage of dualistic land tenure, and therefore the extent to which they've succeeded in animal disease control, and therefore in their success in exporting beef to Europe. At the heart of the analysis is a value chain governance approach that takes account of those context elements and an identification of the related risks. Next, please. So the first item of the context is the EU policy on meat imports from Southern Africa. Global trade in meat is regulated by the World Organization for Animal Health, formerly the Office International des Épizooties, and also through standards agreed between nations. There are important beef trade quotas between Europe and Southern Africa that were originally agreed in under Lome 4 in 1989. At that time, 9,000 tons for Zimbabwe, 3,000 tons for Eswatini. These import quotas or export quotas are conditional on those countries or areas within them being free from foot and mouth disease through proven foot and mouth free zones, traceability, and externally verified veterinary control infrastructures. As I'll show in the paper later on, Zimbabwe lost that market access. Eswatini successfully built markets, especially in Norway, but under EU structures, but recently lost that access. Previous analyses of other countries in Southern Africa with similar beef agreements with the EU, Botswana and Namibia, has shown that these systems can be very vulnerable to rent capture by larger producers and international meat traders. And it's also important that there have been criticisms made of policy incoherence between EU beef import policies or trade policies and EU cooperation policies. Next, please. Second element of the context is the political economy of land. Both countries are very strongly marked by a legacy of expropriation of farmland by white settlers going back to the 1840s in Eswatini, the 1890s in Zimbabwe, and the confinement of African farmers to overcrowded reserve areas in lower potential areas under a modified and distorted form of customary tenure. In Zimbabwe, as we know, this became the defining political issue in post-independence Zimbabwe, leading to the fast-track land reform starting just before 2000 that was associated in international news reports, and in reality with brutality, with corruption by the Mugabe regime, and with the disruption of successful commercial farming operations. But later analysis showed there were also significant benefits to African smallholders, especially in the more arid regions. As a result of fast-track land reform and the chaos that followed, FMD controls in the form of fencing between free and non-free areas broke down during the 2000s, and attempts to restore them now would probably present risks to equity between large and small farmers. Also, as a result, farming systems now map onto tenure in very complex ways. It's no longer a dual system. There are a lot of intermediate farmers share characteristics of both of the previous systems, and differences in market destinations for cattle are a matter of degree rather than of dualism. In Eswatini, the history was very different. The late King Sobhuza managed to play off white settlers against the British authorities in Cape Town, claim protectorate status, and actually claw back land that was taken very early on by white settlers, so that at present, the title deed land, in other words, the commercial land, which is very largely owned by local companies and individuals and some foreign investors, is 39% of the local area, of the total area. Land really in Eswatini is not a salient political issue as far as we can judge. In both the countries, what are called the communal areas in Zimbabwe, the Swazi national land in Eswatini, the non-commercial areas for smallholders suffer from issues of land governance, insufficient or degraded grazing, and poor access to extension. They're also characterized by the multifunctionality and the cultural value of cattle. Next slide, please. Cattle have multiple benefits. Cash income from sales, undoubtedly, but on a needs basis, small farmers tend to sell when there is need rather than in response to market opportunities. Draft power, particularly in Zimbabwe, there have been estimates that draft power represents 64% of the economic value of cattle. A very important use of cattle in bride wealth, known as lobola in Southern Africa, use in rituals, also use of cattle as a form of security, a bank account on the hoof. And then, very important, and this especially related to Eswatini and to women in Eswatini, the valuing of cattle for their role in soil fertility. Direct consumption of milk and meat is important in both countries, and again, a rather specialist use in Eswatini of payment of traditional dues to the chiefs. The way these different benefits or outputs are ranked is very much subject to the farming system, to income opportunities, to gender, to small geographical differences, and to individual preferences, and change over time. It's not a uniform picture, but it's undeniable that these multiple benefits hold down offtake rates. Farmers were less willing to sell than if income was the only criteria given, and they drive a high seasonality of sales, not so much a seasonality of natural seasons, but of things like school fees becoming due at the beginning of the school year. Next slide, please. So our findings, at the heart of it was an analysis that the value chains operating in the two countries could be characterized under a modified version of Gareffi's framework. This is a framework taken from the more academic literature on value chain governance, using three key concepts: the complexity of the knowledge and information that is used to sustain the transaction, what needs to be known, the codifiability of that knowledge and information. Can it be written down? Can it be transmitted in a formal way? And the capabilities of the suppliers to use that knowledge. So we see three forms of market, three forms of value chain here: a reputation-based spot market, highly personalized, with low complexity of transactions, but also low codifiability of transactions, high capabilities for farmers. A domestic market, also partially reputation-based, and those two forms of market are present in both countries. And then an export market, which until very recently was only operating in Eswatini. And the degree of explicit coordination of the value chain and also the power asymmetries within those value chains are higher the further to the right you go in the diagram towards the export market. Next slide, please. So in clearer terms, we see The spot markets in the rural areas, the coordination of the value chain is based on trust, reputation of individual farmers and traders, and price mechanisms. And in such a market, small-scale commercial farmers can be price makers. In the more formal domestic market, there is a reputation element, but main buyers elaborate quality arrangements based on the visible aspects of the animals, and farmers here are mainly price takers. In the export market, quality and sanitary standards that come from the international agreements are controlled by the buyers of the products and to some extent by the national government. But this market is also characterized by informal state business relations, clandestine or covert networks between governmental and economic elites, and by rent capture. In all those cases, professional organizations, cooperatives, and others try to provide technical and economic assistance for horizontal coordination of producers, but their resources and their impact are limited. Next slide. So some of the risks that result, we characterize these in three ways. Risks that are external to the VCs, to the value chains, to do with national economics and national governance, inflationary pressure, declining infrastructure, particularly in Zimbabwe, and the threat of rent capture in both countries. Risks that can be managed to some extent through vertical integration of the value chain and by proactive government policy. Firstly, risk relating to climate change and climate variability, declining cattle numbers in Eswatini, supply volatility with droughts and weather and climate variability. These can, to some extent, be managed by insurance, by climate information services, possibly by emergency purchase of livestock during drought onset, measures that can be taken possibly by either government or by the major commercial players in the value chain. There's a risk of localized overgrazing through poor governance of grazing lands, particularly in Eswatini, and there are serious animal health-related risks involving animal mortality, but also potentially human illness and loss of export, as we've seen when foot and mouth certification ceases. These can be managed again by improved preventive services, surveillance, community and national level, measures again that can be put in place and assisted by both government and commercial actors. And then finally, there are risks that can be managed through better horizontal integration, something that government can support. Things like the youth exodus from the value chain, the worsening exclusion of women, and generally low levels of trust and farmer organization. Next slide, please. Some implications for supporting beef production. Investment in infrastructure and risk management will be important. Tailored support to small producers that really understands their role in the value chain, their multiple benefits from cattle, and some of the constraints upon them, like seasonality. Food safety measures, both for domestic and for imported meat, so that imported meat doesn't unfairly compete with national production, imported poultry meat in particular. And then EU meat import policies that allow innovations such as commodity-based trade, trade based on the actual risk of disease transmission through the meat, rather than remaining based on the concept of disease-free areas. Next slide, please. Some implications for methodologies. We feel we need to look for increased flexibility in the methodology in cases where the commodity at the heart of the value chain is multifunctional. We need to look at increased consideration of historical inequities in land tenure. We do seriously need to look at history to go back as far as the 1840s if necessary to understand these systems. And we need to look at inequality and environmental risk within smallholder tenure systems, not just the questions of equity between smallholder and commercial systems. And finally, we need an analysis of government to be more in-depth and to bring more nuance especially on hybrid forms of coordination that we find in such systems. Next slide, please. And that's my conclusion. Thank you all very much.